the Triathlon Show 354. Hey, what's up everybody, and welcome back to another episode of that Triathlon Show, the podcast presented by scientifictriathlon.com. I'm your host Michael, and on today's episode I interview Dr. Tim Podlogar. Tim is a research fellow at the University of Brimingham and assistant professor at the University of Primorska in Slovenia, and he's also a nutritionist for the Bora Hansgrohe World Tour cycling team. In today's interview with Tim, we discuss all things carbohydrates in endurance sports. This is one of Tim's main areas of expertise, and he's done a lot of research in the area. So we'll go into all sorts of topics, including things like pre, during, and post-workout carbohydrate recommendations, train low strategies, continuous blood glucose monitoring, glucose and fructose, 90 versus 120 grams per hour carbohydrates, and many of the typical questions that come up and get the most up-to-date information from the field of scientific research, but also applied practice, as Tim is somebody who works very much on the applied side of the sport as well. But before that, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that create sports nutrition products, including both carbohydrate products and electrolyte products. They also help you use these products effectively through a range of free tools, services, and content. Precision Fuel and Hydration have partnered up with Swift Tri Academy and will be helping the Swift Tri Academy athletes nail their nutrition and hydration strategy in the lead up to Kona. And in parallel with this, they will be running monthly group rides on Swift, with the next one being this coming Thursday on the 8th of September. So if you just Google Precision Fuel and Hydration Swift Ride, you will find the link with all the information and you can sign up. And remember that as a listener of the podcast, you can get 15% off Precision Fuel and Hydration products by using the code TTS22 at checkout on precisionfuelandhydration.com. And remember that they offer free video consultations and a free fuel and hydration planner on their website. And thank you to Zen8. The Zen8 Indoor Swim Trainer is a swim training tool that you can use at home that allows you to improve your technique, work on power and stamina, and save time and stay consistent. Consistency is one of the main reasons that Zen8 Indoor Swim Trainer can be such a valuable tool, because sometimes you just don't have time to go to the pool with the commute that entails and getting changed and all of that, but you might still have 20 to 30 minutes for an at-home workout, and then the Zen8 Swim Trainer is the perfect supplement to your pool swimming. In addition, it allows you to do things like swim, bike, brick workouts, and work on perfect core activation and streamline with the help of the built-in instability element of the swim bench. It doesn't take up a lot of space, and it is very affordable, and you can get a 20% discount code on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. Finally, it is a risk-free investment. If you don't love it after 2 weeks of using it, send it back and you can get a full refund. Now, without any further ado, let's get into the interview with Dr. Tim Podlogar. Welcome to the Triathlon Show, Tim. How are you doing?
Hi. Thanks for inviting me, and I'm doing fine. Thanks, you.
Yeah, it's a pleasure to have you. Thanks, doing well as well. Can you start by just introducing yourself? Tell the audience a bit more about yourself, who you are, and what you are doing.
So it's a pretty long story. So I have a PhD in exercise metabolism from the University of Brimingham. So pretty much focused on carbohydrate metabolism in particular. I'm currently also employed by the University of Birmingham as a research fellow, working on a project looking at how heat acclimation affects exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates. But other than that, I'm also an assistant professor in one of the Slovenian universities where I deliver some lectures. And I'm also a nutritionist as of this year for Bora Hansgrohe cycling team, working alongside Robert, that I think you had a chance to interview a year or so ago.
I did, yes. That's really a cool position, of course, to hold with one of the World Tour teams. You recently, actually, it's not published yet, I think, but you sent me a manuscript for a paper review of carbohydrate that will be published soon, I'm sure. So a lot of the questions that we'll get into now are based on that manuscript. So we'll talk a lot about carbohydrates, and if we just jump right into that with first discussing carbohydrates before, during, and after competition. let's start by some general recommendations, pre-competition carbohydrate recommendations. Can you talk about practical recommendations, but also the mechanistic underpinnings and so on?
Yeah, so here, like, one of the really important things is to kind of make a difference between like elite athletes and like amateur athletes, but not because like amateur athletes are different in terms of physiology, but it's basically the timing of the start, because amateur athletes usually start their races very early in the morning. And I think this is really important when we look at the, like, from the big picture, what to recommend to them and what to recommend for the elite athletes. For instance, today it's at the time of the recording, like the Vuelta is taking place. And for instance, today the start of the stage is at like after 1 o'clock in the afternoon. And this is very late. So as compared to, like, for instance, like certain amateur races, which would start like at 7 in the morning. So we have to have this in mind when we are talking about nutrition pre-exercise. So if we are talking about like on the day, the main aim would probably be to replenish or fill up the both glycogen stores, so liver and the muscle. And I think this making a difference between the both stores is really important. Why? Because during the night, we will not be using any muscle glycogen stores. Whereas on the other hand, the brain is still working, the organs are still working, so we actually can reduce liver glycogen stores overnight. So the primary aim of the nutrition in the morning is basically to replenish liver glycogen stores. And this is kind of important when we're talking about carbohydrates, especially the sources of carbohydrates. We've recently done a study in which we gave people the same breakfast in terms of the quantity, but with different types of carbohydrates, so glucose and fructose. The reason being that fructose, we know, needs to first go into the liver, is metabolized there, and because it goes first into the liver, it takes care of liver glycogen stores first. And in that study, we actually found that time to exhaustion or time to task failure in the subsequent exercise was longer when people got glucose and fructose as compared to glucose only. So in practical terms, this would probably mean like some sort of rice or porridge oats, and we'll come back to these two ingredients in a bit. And then additionally, we want some sources of fructose, which is like honey, some jam, some juices, or anything like this. So this is like, we want different types of carbohydrates in the morning meal. And then the next important thing, in my opinion, is also type of carbohydrates in terms of like, is it complex or is it simple? If we have started 7 in the morning or like 8 in the morning, so there is not a lot of time to digest the food properly. We actually want quick to digest foods, low fiber, low fat, and for instance, rice is preferable in my opinion over porridge oats. On the other hand, if you start at like 1 p.m. in the afternoon, and you're not doing any running and it's just like cycling, and gastrointestinal discomfort is not going to be like play a big role, then perhaps porridge oats can be a good choice as well. They contain a bit more fat, they contain a bit more fiber, so the release of carbohydrates into the bloodstream will be slower, but this will also like mean that perhaps you will not be as hungry in the morning as you would have been with rice that would get absorbed very, very rapidly. So like, also the next question is then, do we add like protein? Do we add some more fats? And I think it's also then down to like, is it 1 day race? If it's 1 day race, then carbohydrates are the only thing that they matter in that morning. If you're talking about like multiple day stage race, like Grand Tour, then we actually want protein because we need to be thinking about the recovery for the subsequent stages, and we are not really fresh that morning. We are still recovering from the previous stages. So all those questions need to be considered when we like plan the nutrition on the day itself.
Yeah, that's a fantastic answer. And I have a few follow-up questions. First, a lot of amateurs, their stage races are not 3-week stage races, but maybe 3-day or 4-day stage races, for example. Or it could even be racing 2 triathlons back-to-back, sprint triathlons or something, or a sprint and a relay. So in that situation, when you have, let's say you have a 4-day stage race, would you then be concerned also with getting in some protein and some fat, even though it's kind of in between that long stage race that pro cyclists do and a 1-day race?
I would probably like the first thing I would say is like get the carbohydrates right. That's the most important. Get the quantities of carbohydrates high enough. And if there is like time to digest the food, then we add protein and then we add fat. So it's carbohydrates first, then it's protein, and then it's fats. So like if you have problems with eating a lot of food, which many amateur athletes perhaps have, so you can't really reach the intake of sufficient amount of carbohydrates, then obviously you want to reduce the amount of fats and then also perhaps protein, because it's about carbohydrates. That's going to provide you with the energy. So ideally, like, there would be some protein as well, not so much fats, but it depends really what works and what doesn't work. But definitely carbohydrates are a priority.
Got it. And when you mentioned the examples of carbohydrate sources for the pre-race breakfast, in the fructose options, you mentioned things like honey and juices and so on. I noticed that you didn't mention any fruits. Like I imagine for a lot of people, it's probably very common to have a banana, at least in training. Is there a reason that you didn't mention straight up fruits? Is there something in particular going on there that makes you less prone to recommend that?
No, not really. Like some fruits perhaps have a lot more fiber, which we obviously don't want in the early morning. And also you have to check the fructose content of certain fruits, because sometimes fruits are not high in fructose at all, and they're like mostly glucose based. I don't know the fruits that are high in fructose from the top of my head. Like probably grapes are high in fructose, but they also have skin, so they have plenty of fiber. So it's really like down to testing what works. For instance, like I usually have for breakfast rice with pure fructose, and it works fine for me. And I add some like Nesquik powder on the top of it, which is again sugar in 1-to-1 ratio probably. So that works well. And for 1-day race, it's probably fine. For a multiple day stage race, that would be like too boring, I guess.
Yeah. And then you mentioned the study that you did there with the improved time to exhaustion with combining glucose and fructose for breakfast. Did you also look at any mechanisms behind that? Did you look at, for example, I don't even know if it's possible to assess liver glycogen very easily. Did you do anything like that, or was it just a pure time to exhaustion test?
Yeah, it was kind of this the study we did in Slovenia. So we were like kind of limited with the mechanisms that we could investigate. Unfortunately, no, we didn't assess liver glycogen stores. You would need an MRI for this, because biopsies are like probably out of the question these days, especially liver ones. But yeah, it was kind of interesting to see we saw like an improvement of, we're talking about the range of 130 minutes of exercise, and the improvement was like 7 minutes, which is, I think, quite a lot. The breakfast was 2 grams per kilo of body mass, so not a lot of energy at all. And the intensity was the first lactate threshold. And surprisingly, at least to me, there was no change in metabolism during exercise. And I think this is really important. So basically, the total amounts of carbohydrates that were probably more available because of the fructose ingestion were not like oxidized at a higher rate at the start of exercise, because very often you can see like, you have higher glycogen stores at the start of exercise, but you also then oxidize more carbohydrates. So after like 2 hours, you could get to the same point. But in this case, the carbohydrate oxidation rates were exactly the same from the start to the last point when we did measurements in both conditions, meaning that the more carbohydrates that were stored were actually used like to prolong exercise rather than just to burn more carbs and less fat.
Yeah, makes sense. And what about muscle glycogen loading, making sure that you arrive at the start line with fully replenished muscle glycogen store? So that would be dependent on what you eat and how you train in the couple of days before the race. Can you talk more about that?
So yeah, I know that most people recommend like multiple day glycogen loadings protocols, like 2 days in advance of a race. I always go with just 1 day glycogen loading, and the reason being that usually athletes also train the day before, so they go for like 1 hour activation ride or 1 hour or 2 hour spin, and based on the evidence, we know that the more glycogen you have stored, the more you will use it. So I see no sense or no point in like loading 2 days in advance when you will then just be using the lot of glycogen that morning before the race. So I think it's like enough if you just do like that training session the day before, very early in the morning, and then use this stimulus for like replenishing of the glycogen after it, so that you do like kind of a super compensation just after it, and then you just eat like 10 to 12 grams per kilogram of body mass on the day, little fats, moderate amount of protein, and I think this works very well. There is probably enough time to get the levels really high. And yeah, from experience from my athletes, this works pretty well so far. And like, even if we look at the professional cyclists, they don't have like 2 days between stages, and they usually successfully recover in 1 day, and probably get the glycogen levels topped up. And then it's also like the next question is the duration. Do we really need always to do glycogen loading? And I would say pretty much yes, because we can like deplete glycogen stores in 1.5 to 2 hours. Like when we do in the labs glycogen depletion protocols, it's very funny to see that people last like 1.5 to 2.5 hours, and then they basically can't do any more. And this means they are glycogen depleted, and that's the cause of fatigue. So you probably want to super compensate or like get glycogen levels topped up before any activities that are like probably longer than 90 minutes, I would say.
What about if you're doing, a 10K run or something that takes 30 minutes or so, well, depending on your speed, but even your average runner will take less than an hour to do a 10K run. Would you still recommend, and you're going for it, you want to set your personal best or something, would you still recommend glycogen loading for that kind of event?
Probably not like glycogen loading as such, but only like a high carbohydrate intake. So we're like not talking about probably 10 to 12 grams, but like more like 8 grams per kilo of body mass. Because we still kind of want a lot of carbohydrates in the body. Carbohydrate use is more efficient than fat utilization, and like this way we can probably gain a few seconds just by using more carbohydrates. But at the same time, we also don't want to gain a lot of extra weight down to the water retention with glycogen, which can reduce the exercise economy. So it's like, yeah, it's a fine line between going too high and too low. So it's also a bit more about practice, because some people like feel very good or very bad when they do glycogen loading the next day. So it's I would say it's a bit more personal.
Yeah, 8 grams per kilo body weight. A couple of times before races, I've tried to actually calculate how much carbohydrate I'm getting, and I've usually aimed for 10 grams for like a half distance race, for example. But even 8 grams, I've found that I was surprised by how much that is and how difficult it is to get in that amount of carbohydrates. So I think a lot of athletes are actually not aware of just how many carbohydrates you need to consume and how difficult that can actually be unless you really think about it. So what kind of sources of carbohydrates would you recommend for this, let's say, 1 day carb loading? And now we can talk about, a longer race, 90 minutes plus, where you really want to be in that 10 to 12 gram per kilogram range.
Yeah, I'm a person that I'm very well known for be a supporter of Haribo gummies, because I find them to be probably the best source of energy to do like glycogen loading. I don't want to say just eat Haribos, but when you really want to push for high intakes of carbohydrates, you probably want simple carbohydrates, and this works very well. They are glucose fructose based, so they have both carbohydrate types. Also some sweet beverages like juices are pretty easy to digest and pretty good, I think. And the worst would probably be eating some whole grains and trying to be healthy, trying to eat potatoes and stuff. That's going to be a problem, getting all those carbs in. So my recommendation usually is have normal meals like breakfast, lunch, and dinner, with some protein, with some moderate or small amount of fats. But other than that, go with simple sugars, and don't be afraid of eating sugars the day before. It's just fine. You won't get diabetes in 1 day.
Yeah, no, that's good advice, and I found that in practice that's the only way that it's really possible to do it properly. Now moving on to during competition recommendations. What are your recommendations for carbohydrate intake during the competition?
So yeah, this is a really difficult question, especially recently, given some evidence that people can oxidize more than 90 grams per hour, because so far it's been recommended that up to 90 grams of carbohydrates are ingested per hour during prolonged competitions like Ironman probably, or cycling races. And recently there is a trend that people should go higher, to 120, for instance, grams per hour, which kind of is loads. And in my opinion, the first rule is get the glycogen stores up super high, and then the next thing is then the nutrition during exercise, because basically low glycogen stores are a reason for fatigue, and we know that ingesting carbohydrates during exercise can't really save muscle glycogen stores. It saves liver glycogen stores primarily, so helps maintain blood glucose concentrations normal for the longer periods of time. So I think in this regard, race nutrition is more important. But then during exercise, it also comes down to actually the energy expenditure. So for instance, if you're doing an event with 120 watts or 150 or 180 watts on average, the energy expenditure is much lower than, for instance, if you would have gone with 280 watts. And I think this is really important to consider when you're speaking or talking about intakes of carbohydrates, because if there are no requirements for super high intake of carbohydrates, I can't believe the carbohydrates would have been used efficiently. So for most people, I think going with 90 grams per hour still makes most sense. And for female athletes, which are usually lighter, and that's why I say female, because they're just lighter usually, the power outputs are then lower as a result. Even going with up to 60 grams per hour makes sense. And another thing that I've been kind of practicing with my athletes is to gradually increase the intake over time in a race. So if you're riding for 5 or 6 hours, when you start, you have full glycogen stores, muscle and liver. and the muscle is not really ready to take up more glucose because the glycogen is in there. So what you do with very high rates of ingestion rates of carbs, you just suppress fat oxidation rates, and you don't do anything about sparing glycogen. So I would probably start with like 70 grams in the first hour and then try to increase the intake towards the end, because that's when glycogen stores in the muscle start to go low, and the glucose uptake by the muscles themselves, it starts to go up because there is not enough glycogen left in them. And that's when we see the highest rates of exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates, so the carbohydrates that we ingest. And like if the event is super long and if the gut is trained, so we are able to tolerate, I see no problem in going with 120 or even more. And I can probably say that, professional cyclists sometimes go even higher. I've seen numbers like 140, 150 grams per hour without tissues and with very good results. Sometimes one of the things with like in stage races is, they say they calculate the energy expenditure and they want to match energy intake. So if you go with super high intake, for instance, during the stage, then you obviously have to reduce the amount of energy that's ingested after the stage. And if we compare like 5-hour long activity, 90 versus 120 grams per hour, you can come up to 2 grams per kilogram of body mass that you could ingest in the recovery time. So I think this is also important to take into consideration for stage races, whereas for like one-day races, going with 90, and progressing to 120, that's perfectly fine and probably advisable, but that's really for elite athletes, I would say.
That's another great answer, and I have a couple of follow-up questions. First, regarding increasing carbohydrate intake towards progressing carbohydrate intake through the event. In triathlon, what's commonly done, of course, is, you don't consume anything during the swim, and then on the bike, it's easy to carry nutrition and consume nutrition compared to the run. So a lot of athletes just consume the most on the bike and then a bit less on the run and nothing on the swim. So how would you recommend in a triathlon context? Because then you might, would you still try to basically train your gut to be able to consume the most on the run, or at least as much on the run as on the bike, or would you have a different recommendation for triathlon compared to cycling?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I've been thinking about triathlon quite a lot as well. And one of the things, probably the big mistakes that triathletes do when it comes to fueling is they have like a certain plan. So let's go with 90 grams per hour throughout the event, for instance. And they start experiencing gastrointestinal issues in the run, and they keep eating because that's the plan. That's what the plan said. And I think this is kind of a big problem because gastrointestinal discomfort is usually caused by residual carbohydrates sitting in the intestines. So why add more carbohydrates at that point? And I think it makes no sense to just keep eating, because if it's not, the carbohydrates that are already in the intestines are not being absorbed, then adding more would just make the situation worse. So it's all about thinking what the plan is, and then how do you feel. So if you feel okay, then you can progress with this intake. Otherwise, you just reduce it. And it's also like one of the things that you can think about is the concept of a funnel. So you eat a lot of carbohydrates on the bike, and carbohydrates obviously don't get absorbed straight away, so you need some time for the absorption to take place. And the residual carbohydrates will then be absorbed during the run. And if you go too high towards the end of the bike, you might be paying with these unabsorbed carbohydrates during the run. in the early stages. So perhaps on the bike, you have to do like a lot of carbohydrates in the beginning and then see how you feel. And then perhaps towards the end, even decrease the intake, so that you start the run session without residual carbohydrates. And then if you're feeling okay, you then again increase the intake during the run.
I think that makes a lot of sense, especially in something like an Ironman, where when you get on the bike, you've already been swimming for around 50 minutes if you're one of the fastest athletes, or maybe 1 hour and a half if you're one of the slower athletes, or even longer. So you have gone a long time of exercise without getting any energy into you. So then it does make sense to really kind of not just fuel a lot early on the bike to fuel that bike, but the swim that came before it, and that you didn't have any chance to fuel during. So I like that approach. And regarding the 90 grams, 120 grams, even 60 grams in some cases, if you were to just give some very rough recommendations, and we can maybe do this as well from a triathlon context, what level of athlete and what distance would you recommend maybe experimenting with going higher than 90 grams for? And for what level of athlete and what distance is 90 grams appropriate? And for what level of athlete and a distance might less than like 60 grams be the best starting point, at least, to experiment with?
So I'd probably say like around 3 hours, so up or above. So for more than 3 hours, I would probably go with 90 grams per hour for most athletes. With elite athletes, perhaps 120 grams per hour. And then for like some novice female athletes that are super light, I would go with 60 only to prevent any gastrointestinal discomfort, and because actually the energy expenditure is not as high. Whereas if it's less than 3 hours, as I said before, if you have full glycogen stores, then you don't need a lot of like kind of additional energy, because you probably you need it for like last 45 minutes or so. So going with like up to 90 grams, 45 to 90 grams, like 90 for elites, and then 45 for amateur athletes. That would probably work pretty well.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And moving on then to after the competition, what's the recommendations there?
Yeah, so this is another really nice discussion to have. So one of the things I really like to have, like after every single session, is it easy or is it hard? I usually recommend to have protein and carbohydrates straight away. So like the first thing that happens, you get the carbs, you get the protein, and very little fat and very little fiber to actually initiate the recovery processes as quickly as possible. And usually like the recommended dose for carbs is around 1 to 1.5 grams per kilogram of body mass. And I think it becomes also again important to combine different carbohydrate types, so glucose-based carbohydrates and fructose. So again, like certain juices work really well, or even Fanta or Coke that we see many professional riders using, because these are sugars. And obviously the protein to start also the protein synthesis in the damaged fibers. So this is kind of the most important thing, getting the energy in as quickly as possible. And then the next
and a follow-up a follow-up on that. So when you say when you want to get it in straight away, the first thing after exercise, we've heard a lot of times about the 30-minute window, it has been called, but you're basically saying that, well, you would prefer it to be something that you do immediately. So what is the benefit of doing it immediately, or what do we know about the time course and the effectiveness of uptake based on how long you do it after exercise?
Yeah, I'm not too concerned about like really the window of opportunity, because we know it really doesn't really exist if you like have the recovery of 24 hours or even more. The thing is that if you kind of prolong this time, you kind of lose the time to ingest the sufficient amount of carbohydrates for the next day. Because obviously, if you finish like the day at like 4 p.m. and wait another hour, then it's 5 p.m. and then you don't want to eat just before sleep, so you're then limited with a really limited amount of time when you can actually eat. And so getting food in as quickly as possible makes it possible for actually to ingest sufficient amounts of food in the day. And this way you kind of, you achieve the replenishment of muscle and liver glycogen stores. And then if you wait, you're basically, in elite athletes, you did basically reduce the amount of time that is available for replenishing of glycogen stores. But in amateur athletes, what I'm finding also like day-to-day training is that if they don't eat straight away, they have food cravings later in the day because they basically starve themselves. And basically they then overeat for the rest of the day or the next day, unless we kind of sort out the nutrition after the training sessions straight away.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And if you remember where you were going before I cut you off there with that question, you can keep going with the post-competition recommendations.
I kind of forgot where I was going.
Well, then I'll direct us back on track. So if we talk then about an actual race, or maybe it's a really long, hard training day, but let's talk about races. So you've done a race that is 3 hours or longer, and what's the recommendations in that case?
The next thing is always look ahead. What the next training session is, right? What the next session is going to be, because when I look at the nutrition, I don't look at the nutrition as from 0 to 24 hours in a day. I always look at between 2 training sessions. So the next day basically starts after this recovery meal that you get. And then you start thinking about what's coming, how much glycogen I need to undertake that training session, how recovered I am for that training session. So for instance, like if I have like 2-hour easy ride on the day or a training session, and the next day is super like hard demanding intervals, a double day for instance, then I would have to kind of eat a lot for the rest of the day, a lot of carbohydrates. And actually, if we were to look at the energy expenditure and energy intake from 0 to 24 hours on that day, you would be in an energy surplus. Because you basically are fueling on the day for the next day. So it's kind of the maths become more complicated, but always like fuel for the work required on the next day. And then it comes down to also whether you want to like care for recovery, or is it like a really easy session and you can kind of do it with a slightly reduced glycogen stores, or is this even an option? So you have really a lot of possibilities there. But the most important thing is to ask yourself, what do I need to get through the next training session?
Do you have any numbers in terms of, for example, with the Bora Hansgrohe riders, if they have a really hard day the next day, they go out and do an easy 2-3 hour ride in the morning, and then they have the entire day to recover, and then the next day is going to be a really hard day, an intense day. How many grams per kilo body weight of carbohydrates would they be looking to get in to fuel for that session? Because it's not a race, but it's still an important training session. So what would the carbohydrate intake requirement be?
So I can probably say when I calculate the intakes, I always like predict what the energy expenditure of the upcoming training session will be. And then I just work backwards and distribute the carbohydrates during the session and then in the recovery, so that they are in energy balance from the end of the one session to the end of the next one. And that's how I usually do it. And then you just correct for the mistakes you've made in the assumptions of how much they will expend during this training session. So it can be a lot, it can be very little. And yeah, so it's really difficult to like really say the quantities.
Yeah. And final question then, if let's say you do your last Ironman of the season and then you have 2 weeks off, does it matter what you eat or after the Ironman? Or let's say you have that's a bad question actually. Let me rephrase it. Let's say you do an Ironman, but then 3 weeks later you have a half Ironman. You're not going to train the next couple of days. You're going to recover from the Ironman, but then you want to get back into building up training again because you only have 3 weeks until the next race. So given that you have 2 days of no training after the race, does it matter what you eat after the race, or can you be relaxed about that and then basically start thinking about that in a couple of days when you get back into training again?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And in terms of physiology, yeah, it matters. In terms of psychology, it probably doesn't matter. And I think nutrition is not just about physiology. It's not just about numbers, but it's also about feeling good. And basically, it's recovery of the physiology and also the mind. You have to mentally be prepared for the next training block for the next training sessions. And perhaps if for a certain person that means that he can enjoy some more, like, I don't know, unhealthy, let's say, foods, and this will help them get through the next important training block without any big cravings for certain foods, then I think that's fine. And I really don't see a problem with like having a few, like, let's say, cheat days after the important or really hard races. That's just fine. It's not just about physiology, it's also psychology that's important.
Yeah, absolutely. So let's move on to some discussions related to carbohydrate use and manipulation in training. So first of all, if we discuss a little bit around train low strategies that we have talked about on this podcast before, but now let's get the latest, most up-to-date information from you. What's your take on train low strategies? If you should use them, when to use them, and how to use them?
So yeah, train low strategies. So basically, to just do like an intro. So the aim is to have primarily low muscle glycogen stores before the start of the training session, so that you potentiate the responses of such a training session after it, so that you can get bigger stimulus for a given training workout. And in some research has shown that this can actually lead into performance improvements, and there is some evidence that says there is no difference as compared to like training with normal carbohydrate availability. And I think it all comes down to the type of athletes we are working with, and how much time they have available for training. Because training with low carbohydrate availability, so with low glycogen stores at the start of the exercise, means that we can't really ride for 5 or 4 hours at relatively high intensity. If you're even talking about like the first lactate threshold, we can forget about 4 hours with no or very little muscle glycogen at the start. So what we lose by doing this training with low glycogen is the training volume. Whereas in athletes, for instance, that are limited in time, for instance, like you have 10 hours a week and you want to use it wisely, that can be a really good way of making or achieving very similar adaptations. Like you only do like a 2-hour ride in the morning after not consuming any carbohydrates after the previous training session the previous day. You only have 2 hours, and you perhaps get benefits as if you would do like a 3-hour long ride with normal carbohydrate availability. On the other hand, we also know that training volume for elite athletes is probably of paramount importance. So you really can't afford to reduce the training volume so that you can do certain training sessions with low carbohydrate availability at the start, or even risk more muscle damage and prolong the recovery. So I would never actually recommend doing like low glycogen training sessions in elite athletes, especially knowing that most of these sessions will actually result in low glycogen stores anyway, because the duration of the training would be so high. And the training, like the relative intensity is also so high that, they will be depleted and pretty empty by the end of the session. And I think that's a stimulus big enough to induce the adaptations thereafter. So to sum up, I think it's useful for people that are time limited, but it's not useful, and I think can lead to overtraining even in athletes that have all the time available for training.
Yeah, I think it's a very interesting point you make there with the elite athletes or high volume athletes that can do the long rides, that they might still finish with low glycogen stores and get the same adaptations anyway. And I think it was, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you know, but was it James Morton who coined the term finish low, so as opposed to train low, which implies starting with low glycogen. If the ride is long enough, and then you might still finish with low muscle glycogen, and that could just give you those same adaptations, plus of course the extra volume that you get in. So of course the overall stimulus would be in theory be higher anyway. But a follow-up question on, if you are a more time limited athlete and you might have some use for train low strategies, how would you go about implementing that? For example, how often, how frequently would you do that kind of training, and how would you make sure that you get to the workout in a low muscle glycogen state?
So I think, first of all, this is very individual. So for instance, some people really struggle when they have low glycogen availability. So for instance, the most popular strategy is the sleep low strategy. So you do a really hard training session on day one, like intervals, you well fuel them, and because it's interval training session, you will probably finish it with low glycogen stores. And then for the rest of the day, you would withhold from carbohydrates. So carbohydrates, just protein and some fat. And then next morning, you would jump on the bike and do that 1.5 to 2 hour long training session at moderate to low intensity. For some people, this would be no problem, like to execute, whereas some would first of all struggle in the afternoon, like mentally, would be like very useless at home. If they have kids, that would be really could be bad parenting, because you don't have energy to do much. And then many people also struggle sleeping. There is actually one study showing that there is no problems with sleeping, but myself, I personally experience a lot of problems when I'm low in glycogen, so I sleep very badly. And there are some other people as well. So if you fall into this category, then you have a problem. If you sleep normally, then it's perfectly fine. And then the next morning, you would do this training session. And especially in the beginning, when you do this for the first few times probably, one of the strategies that you can use to actually get through the session is to add carbohydrates at some point during the training session. I did a study on this during my PhD when I was into this kind of low glycogen training, and I believed in it. I'm not such a believer anymore, but at the time I was thinking, how can we still get the training volume up? And one of the proposals I had was to get carbohydrates ingested with a delay, so that probably the insulin level don't really go up. They will see no spike, and that the fat oxidation rates remain high. And actually, this is what we did. So, after half an hour of exercise, we started added carbohydrates, and basically blood glucose levels were stabilized and were stable to the end of the session. And this way, we didn't even reduce fat oxidation rates. Fat oxidation rates were super high. Also, and the blood glucose was stable, and the perceived effort was lower. And I think this kind of strategy would work pretty well as well. Kind of delayed feeding. But over time, probably the athletes would get used to it, and even these carbohydrates wouldn't be necessary anymore. Another strategy would be to use more caffeine or do mouth rinsing. So just have the carbs in the mouth, but not swallow them, and then just like spill them out. These are all the strategies that are sometimes recommended for this kind of training.
Yeah. And regarding the frequency, if an athlete is pretty tolerant to this kind of training, they seem to be responding well, how frequently would you say that they could do it?
I would probably personally do it like up to max twice a week, probably like once a week. For instance, like you have one session, very easy. You recover well after each training session, and then you do that glycogen depleted.
Yep, makes sense. Yeah, I know in the review that is going to be published soon, you talk quite a bit about REDS, relative energy deficiency in sport, as well. I'm not going to go into that too much because we have had a fairly recent episode with Dr. Margot Mountjoy about that specific topic. But I think we should briefly at least mention the connection between carbohydrate availability and REDS, but also bone health in particular. So if you can just give some comments around their relationship.
Yeah, I think it's kind of carbohydrate availability makes the biggest impact on the hormones in terms of like cortisol, glucagon in the recovery process. And for instance, if we don't have sufficient amount of carbohydrates, obviously the body will sense that there is not enough energy, especially carbohydrates, because carbohydrates are the preferred fuel, and then will make adjustments in the way how the body functions, and will basically perhaps slow down certain processes like bone formation or recovery. And there is more and more evidence that basically the RED-S is primarily down to carbohydrate availability, not necessarily like overall energy availability, but really primarily about carbohydrates. And I think this makes sense. If you have like liver glycogen stores that are constantly low, this might mean low glucose levels, and we know that like hypoglycemia is obviously a problem. And also if you have low liver glycogen stores, then what you do to maintain blood glucose levels is making glucose molecules from like muscle tissue or from protein. So you start breaking down the body rather than like building it. So it's like in very simple terms, you have a problem in there. And I was looking at like, because energy availability is really important for cyclists, and there is a really nice study from a long time ago. Can't remember the author, but it actually showed that it was carbohydrate availability that was, for instance, driving the low carbohydrate availability that was driving the low testosterone levels in like male athletes rather than fat availability, because sometimes or very often we hear that you have low testosterone levels because fat intake is not sufficient, but it can also be that carbohydrate intake is not sufficient. So it's not like just one answer. You have it's not just about the calories. It's, I think, mostly about the carbohydrates.
Yeah, and another concept that has been talked about a lot and researched quite a bit in the last 5 or 10 years maybe is carbohydrate periodization. So can you define first of all what that is, and then give some of your thoughts and recommendations for if and how to use it?
Yeah, so the carbohydrate periodization probably started with this train low strategy that we discussed. So basically, it was shown that you can potentiate the responses to training sessions by starting training sessions with lower carbohydrate availability. So for some time, it was really like the periodization was very polarized. So like training sessions that are low intensity, you do them like with low carbohydrate availability during and before. That's it. And then for high intense training sessions, you load the glycogen stores and you do them effectively. This is kind of the probably the whole strategy to carbohydrate periodization. But probably now these days it's more about like just making sure that you fuel for the work you require. So you don't say like, okay, you have 4-hour long training session day after day, and then you look at the table of the sports nutrition recommendations. Okay, for 4-hour long training session, I need like 10 grams per kilogram of body weight of carbohydrates, and you do this day after day. But rather you look at what the demands of these 4 hours are. Is it interval training session? Okay, perhaps I need more than 10. I need 12 grams per kilogram of body mass of carbs. And then if it's a 4-hour long training session, low intensity, I can perhaps get away with 8. So it's always like a bit more about balancing the carbohydrate intake based on the demands of the next training session. And as you mentioned, I think it's more about finishing the training session with low glycogen rather than starting the training session with low glycogen. And if we consider about this, like finishing the training session with low glycogen to be like the most important stimulus, then it makes sense to actually give enough energy so that you get through the session, but not too much. So that you're like, I don't know, you have a really hard day today, and the next day is just 2 hours easy. And because I had a really hard day today, I can eat today like 10 grams of kilogram of carbs. That's probably too much for the next training session. And you won't get the adaptations after it that you would normally get if you had like less, because obviously the session is easy. So I think this is kind of the carbohydrate periodization these days, like really fueling for the work required, thinking one step ahead, and seeing what really needs to be eaten.
Yeah, I think that's from this question and other questions as well. It's becoming one of the main takeaways from this interview, thinking one step ahead and looking at what you have coming up, and having that be a big part of your nutrition and carbohydrate planning. So that's really good information. And what about training the gut? Another topic that has been discussed and researched more recently. What's your take on that?
So the most important thing is to discern between tolerance and absorption. So we do the train the gut usually, thinking that by eating a lot of carbohydrates on the bike or during the run, we will train the body to be able to absorb more carbohydrates from the intestines into the bloodstream. But this is just a theory, and I think what we are actually doing is building the tolerance for carbohydrates, because the gut doesn't really discern between exercise time and rest. And if there was I think it's not a really sufficient stimulus to actually increase the amount of transporters for the carbohydrates, just eating on the bike. I think if we can actually increase the amount of transporters, we will do this by having a really high carbohydrate diet throughout the day, so that basically the intestines keep getting the high amount of carbs, not just during exercise, but throughout the day. Whereas during exercise, training the gut is basically building the tolerance. And I think the first step we need to have is have the tolerance for the carbohydrates to sit in the intestines, so that they can get absorbed. And then it's down to personal capacity to actually absorb them. And I'm not sure if we can actually increase the absorption rates of carbohydrates with any kind of training course, because there is not a lot of evidence on this, but we can certainly improve the tolerance to carbohydrates, if that makes sense.
Yeah. It's really interesting that you say that the absorption might be more related to the day-to-day intake than just within training. And it reminds me of what was kind of popular a few years ago of having a low-carb, high-fat diet, but then racing high. And if at least if that theory holds, that you increase the transporters through your daily diet, then that would basically only mean that, well, your you're wasting the carbohydrates you're taking in the race if you're never eating carbohydrates in the day to day, because you can't absorb them anyway.
Yeah, I don't really have like a lot of like proof to say that I'm correct in this regard, but recently I did study 120 versus 90 grams an hour, and one of the participants, which was the strongest out of all, he was doing for 3 hours, I think 290 watts. So yeah, a strong guy. This was 90% of his, or 95% of his first threshold. And he's known to be like doing a lot of this low carbohydrate training. And his maximal carbohydrate, exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates were not super high. So like they were like on average and very similar to mine. Although I'm like probably like 30 centimeters or so smaller than him. Kind of showing that, yeah, even though he's highly trained, he doesn't have the capacity to actually absorb those carbohydrates into the body. And perhaps if he had like more carbohydrates day to day, perhaps he would have the capacity to utilize more. But this is something, yeah, we still need to kind of investigate in the future. Find a relationship, if there is a relationship between daily diet and ability to oxidize ingested carbs during exercise.
Yeah, that sounds like a good potential PhD project for somebody. And then if we move on a little bit to one topic that you talk about as well in the review is around personalizing carbohydrate intake. You mentioned it throughout this interview as well. First of all, can we use knowledge of the exercise demands and the athlete's physiological status and physiological response to exercise to make any further recommendations around how to individualize carbohydrate intake?
It's a question that probably has probably two answers. So some people say that you have to individualize everything, like the intake of like the composition of carbohydrates, fats, and protein. Whereas when I work with athletes, most of the time I just look at the carbohydrates, and I really want to make sure that the carbohydrate availability is as high as possible at all times, especially in racing, and sufficient. And I know that some people like do calculations on how much carbohydrates have been used in racing or training. I don't know if this concept like holds true, because first of all, you can change the substrate utilization by having different starting glycogen concentrations, by having different nutritional strategies during exercise. And this can all influence how much carbohydrates you're actually using during exercise. And also the next point is, well, let's say you come up with a number, I've utilized 300 grams of carbohydrates. Do I now just replace 300 grams of carbohydrates? Well, the answer is no, because if you give people like a person 300 grams of carbohydrates, this doesn't mean exactly 300 grams of carbohydrates will simply go into glycogen, because some of it will be oxidized. So at the end of the day, there are so many unknowns that you can't really, in my opinion, do like very solid predictions. And I think like just making sure that especially in racing or intense training periods, that carbohydrate availability as high as possible. I think that's the most important part. And on top of that, you add fats and protein. And another like probably the problem with this approach is, or some people would say it, well, you don't train fat oxidation rates. And I agree, you don't really train fat oxidation rates. What you actually do is you increase the fitness. And if we were to do like a fat max test in the lab today with an elite athlete and an amateur athlete, and the elite athlete can be on a high carb diet, and amateur athlete can be on a low carb diet, so he's fat adapted, I'm pretty sure that the elite athlete would always have higher fat oxidation rates because his body is simply fitter. And I think this is the really important thing is, what do you do in training? The most important thing is get the fitness up, the VO2 max up, the thresholds up, And only when like those are maximized, you can't go any higher, you can start thinking about how to increase fat oxidation rates. Because otherwise, what you do by kind of training the body to use more fat is inducing low carbohydrate availability, and you risk losing, or you risk not recovering, you risk getting into red S, and so on and so forth. So I think the most important thing is always get the fitness up, and then you can start about this substrate utilization rate.
And even if you don't get in the like really bad situation of something like red S or just things like that, then you might still not be able to train with the quality to increase your fitness, as you said earlier.
Yeah.
So I think that's good advice. And also what you said before about that even if you could know how much glycogen you used or how much carbohydrate you used, that we don't necessarily, it's difficult to know that, but you also don't necessarily know how much you should take in after that. I think that's an important general point to make, that in this day and age when there's a lot of different apps and software and things, not just in endurance sports, but in health and fitness in general, that are trying to make very precise individual recommendations and predictions. And a lot of times there's not solid evidence behind that. And there are so many factors that influence things that it's really nice. Like I think false precision is common in a lot of places around us, and it's good to be aware of all of the factors that make things murky and difficult to make accurate predictions about, because then you can prevent a situation where you get recommendations that are not necessarily correct, basically.
Yeah. Like in the team I work with, we have an app which calculates all those things. I always look at the data. I always like see the data, and then in my head, and I start thinking, what does this tell me? And so more data is useful, but the most important thing is that you know the limitations of the data you have, and you know how to like operate with this data. Because just following blindly, those apps can lead into a disaster in certain scenarios.
Yeah. And what do you think about continuous blood glucose monitoring as a way to inform your carbohydrate intake?
It's a really popular thing, and honestly, I don't really think we need such a device, and I don't think there is any benefit to it, because like blood glucose levels, they remain pretty much stable during exercise, especially if you're exercising above the first lactate threshold. And if we did a lactate threshold test, or like a graded exercise test to task failure, and we measured lactate and we measured glucose, we would see a very similar curve actually. So the higher the intensity, the higher the glucose concentrations. And so glucose concentrations can be affected by both exercise intensity and also the intake of carbohydrates in the body. So probably dropping glucose levels below like 5 millimoles, so getting into hypoglycemia, knowing this can be important. But at the same time, we can simply prevent this by eating enough on the bike. So by eating probably 90 grams per hour, we can prevent this drop of blood glucose in most athletes anyway. So this additional piece of information doesn't really help us if we do the homework and actually fuel properly. On the other hand, at higher intensities, knowing blood glucose concentrations doesn't tell us much, because blood glucose concentrations are influenced by so many other factors that we simply can't know where they're coming from. Like even stress can probably increase blood glucose concentrations. And we can't really know where this is coming from. And for instance, we did this breakfast study that I mentioned earlier, like fructose glucose, and people were riding after task failure. And my hypothesis was that at the end, blood glucose concentrations will start to decline And for the longer we can actually maintain the blood glucose concentrations, the longer people will go. But when we measured blood glucose concentrations at the point of fatigue or task failure, basically nobody was in hypoglycemia. So blood glucose concentrations were basically normal. We couldn't see anything there. And I think this is not just the only paper that shows that. There are some other papers also showing that the exercise intensity, the higher it is, the less you will see in blood glucose. So only like at relatively low intensities, you will see a decline in blood glucose concentrations, and this will be then indicative of insufficient carbohydrate intake. Whereas at higher intensities, which races, intensities where races take place, this is probably less useful in my opinion. So at the moment, I don't really see a lot of sense in using that.
Yeah. And one of the final questions here, moving on a little bit. So what about differences in sex and age and how that influences carbohydrate intake? So you mentioned already that lighter female athletes, they might need to consume less during races. Are there any other differences to consider, whether it's in training or in racing or in the day-to-day, depending on the sex and age of an athlete primarily?
My opinion is probably unpopular, and I say that there is probably not enough of a difference that I would change the recommendations. Unless we're talking about I think a light male athlete and the same size women athlete would probably get the same recommendation from me. I wouldn't do any different if they're the same fitness level, same body characteristics. I would probably be very similar, but at the same time, I would probably listen to the menstrual cycle and how they cope with it mentally, how they sometimes they can actually struggle in different phases. I would then try to find a way to increase the carbohydrate availability to get through certain periods easier. But I would definitely not say you're in a phase when you are oxidizing more fats and that's why you will have less carbohydrates in the diet, or that because you're a female, you should have, I don't know, I've heard less fructose or some other crazy stuff. I don't buy those things, and I think there is not a lot of evidence to support those claims. So apart from the actual body size and the power output differences, I don't see a really big difference in terms of how we fuel those athletes.
Yeah, and that's aligned with what I interviewed Kelly McNulty a while back about the influence of the menstrual cycle on training and nutrition and everything really what that's related to endurance sports, and she basically said the same thing, that you can't make a blanket statement for everybody at the individual level. Yes, there might be things that you need to do, but not something that is true at a population level between the two sexes. And what about age? Is there anything there that you would think about?
It's another probably a good question. One of the things that with age we see is that, for instance, when I work with younger athletes, I can kind of influence them in a easier way. So I can tell them exactly you have to eat this much carbohydrates, and they will not come back to me and ask, well, carbohydrates are perhaps bad for me or sugars are bad. So my approach, to those athletes would be much easier from my perspective as compared to somebody that has 50 or 40 years, because he will have certain ideas in his mind. And I will, as a nutritionist, have to find a solution how to overcome them. And it's more about psychology, I guess, rather than physiology. And with age, I think carbohydrates are as important. Protein becomes even more important, especially if really, much older individuals. So perhaps the portion size just needed to be higher. We're talking about 60-year-old athletes now because of the anabolic resistance. But other than that, the general things are pretty much the same. Again, it's all about the power output or energy expenditure during the exercise, the fitness levels. So if we have an athlete with a VO2 max of like 65, that is age 65, or an athlete that is aged, 30 with the same VO2 max, that probably the differences in nutrition would probably be non-existent pretty much.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. And finally, a general question: what future research on carbohydrates or nutrition in general within endurance sports do you think is the most important, or that would you really like to see conducted personally?
Yeah, I would really like to see more, to see how important that personalization actually is, and how whether it's actually personalization or it's day-to-day variability. For instance, if we measure exogenous carbohydrate oxidation rates in different people on one day, we see kind of large differences. But would these differences be the same after every single day? Can we actually personalize those recommendations and actually find in the lab you have to have exactly 93 grams per hour of carbohydrates on the bike, 80 on the run, and this way you will prevent gastrointestinal distress, because this way you will make sure that all carbohydrates get absorbed into the body. I think this would be super cool if we ever came to this point. And also to be able to measure how much carbohydrates people need for the recovery, to recover optimally. Being able to measure glycogen stores before races would be super interesting to me. To be able to monitor the status of athletes. At the moment, the ultrasound method is not as accurate. So this kind of, to see whether, first of all, personalization is even possible. Is it down to day-to-day variability, or is it basically a personal thing? And then how we can influence it, and how we can basically provide recommendations based on this.
Yeah, no, all of those sounds like really interesting topics. So let's hope that the future brings more evidence in those areas. Now let's move on to the rapid fire questions. So take just one sentence to answer these. And the first one is: what's your favorite book or resource related to endurance sports?
Probably Exercise Physiology textbook by Scott Powers, and I think some other authors. That's my go-to resource when it comes to exercise physiology.
And what's an important habit that you benefited from athletically, professionally, or personally?
Having a routine, so waking up the same time every single day and trying to do things. Start exercising at 5 a.m. And then do the rest of the work later on. And
finally, who's somebody that you look up to or that has inspired you?
I was thinking a lot about this question, and I wanted to say Steve Jobs, but he's deceased. Then I wanted to say Tim Noakes, but I don't know in what kind of mind he is these days. So I'll probably say my boss, Garrett Wallace.
Perfect. And finally, where can listeners follow you and reach out to you if they perhaps would consider your nutrition questions, your nutrition services, and so on?
I'm mostly active on Instagram. I was blocked already a few months ago, so I'm currently found at T Podlogar, TPODLOGAR, but also on Twitter where I'm more quiet. I just listen and learn, whereas on Instagram I'm more vocal and I express my opinions all the time.
Yeah. Of course you were blocked. You have pretty extreme views. No, just kidding. Sometimes these algorithms work in mysterious ways, I guess.
Yeah.
Well, Tim, it's been fantastic to chat to you. You're full of knowledge, so it's great to get to learn from you. Appreciated it a lot, and hope to talk to you again another time. Thank you so much.
Thanks for inviting me. It was a pleasure.
I hope that you enjoyed that interview. As always, you can find the show notes on scientifictriathlon.com. We'll have links to Tim's website, Instagram, and Twitter, and I highly recommend giving him a follow on Instagram. He often posts super informative Instagram stories, so definitely worth checking them out. Also, there is a long list of studies related to the topics we discussed included in the show notes and the episode description, so check them out if you're interested in going deeper. Next Monday, I interview Dr. Callum Brownstein on the science of fatigue mechanisms and the practical applications for endurance athletes. Dr. Brownstein completed his PhD on this specific topic and is one of the top experts in the world on fatigue mechanisms and fatigability. So make sure you tune in for that one. It will be a good episode, I'm sure. And I want to give a reminder about our training camps as well. Remember that we're running 2 training camps in 2023. One in March in Mallorca, which is a bigger camp with lots of athletes and coaches and open for a wide range of abilities. It is in the northern part of Mallorca with the famous climbs, Sacalobra and all of that, in a great hotel focused on triathletes and cyclists. It will be a great time, so sign up for that if you are interested, or email me to learn more. But we also have a smaller training camp in the Algarve in the south of Portugal in January, which is for just 15 advanced athletes. So this really is for quite advanced athletes with a fairly high fitness level. We're looking to make it a very coherent group of similar abilities, and athletes that are really looking to build a serious foundation for the year of racing ahead. So a bit more chop wood, carry water, I would say, but it will be brilliant if that's what you're looking for. So check out all information on scientifictriathlon.com and email me if you have any more questions. Finally, big thanks to our sponsors, Precision Fuel and Hydration, that you can find on precisionfuelandhydration.com. Use their free fuel and hydration planner to understand your fluid, electrolyte, and carbohydrate needs and get a specific and effective race strategy. Also, book a free video consultation with the team if you want to refine your strategy further. Use the code TTS22 at checkout for 15% off your first order of their products. And thank you to Zen8. Use the Zen8 swim trainer to improve your technique, power, stamina, and your swim training consistency. Get 20% off your order with the promo code that you can get on zen8swimtrainer.com/TTS. And don't forget that it's a risk-free investment. If you don't love it after 2 weeks, send it back and you'll get a full refund. Thank you, as always, for listening. Keep training smart and keep loving triathlon.